My husband's mother handed me divorce papers at my own kitchen table while my children were asleep upstairs. She was smiling when she did it. Before we go any further, subscribe to this channel, because stories like this one are proof that the people who try to break you sometimes hand you exactly what you need to rebuild. My name is Nora Callahan. I was 38 years old when my life split in half, and I want you to understand who I was before that happened, not the version of me that existed afterward, not the woman who learned to fight, but the woman I was on an ordinary Tuesday morning before any of this began. Because I think that woman matters. I think she deserves to be seen clearly before everything else gets layered on top of her. I grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee, the youngest of 3 children in a household held together by my mother's particular brand of disciplined love. My father was a good man and a distant one. He worked long hours at a distribution company and came home tired and quiet and was present in the way that a piece of furniture is present. Always there, rarely noticed, impossible to imagine the room without. My mother was the one who taught me how to be in the world. She was a practical woman, not a sentimental one, and the lessons she passed down were practical lessons. Pay your own bills, keep your own counsel, never let someone else hold the thing you most need. I didn't follow all of her advice. I was 24 when I married Kevin Callahan, and I followed the feeling rather than the logic of it. Kevin was from Cincinnati. His family had money, not enormous wealth, but the substantial, settled kind that comes from 2 generations of a successful commercial construction business. His father, Dennis Callahan, had built Callahan & Sons into a respected regional name before his health forced a partial retirement, and Kevin had stepped into a senior role in the company in his late 20s. When I met Kevin, he had the easy confidence of someone who had never had to wonder about the fundamentals: money, belonging, where he fit. He was also genuinely kind, in the early years. I want to be fair about that, because this story is not about pretending a person was always who they became. Kevin was warm and funny, and he looked at me like I was something worth looking at, and I was young enough and hopeful enough to build a life on that feeling. We married in Knoxville on a June afternoon. My mother cried at the reception. Kevin's mother, Margaret Callahan, gave a toast that was gracious and polished and contained, in retrospect, a careful absence of warmth. Margaret was 61 when I married her son. She was a trim, angular woman with silver hair and an immaculate appearance and the particular kind of intelligence that expresses itself primarily as control. She had built her life around the Callahan name and the Callahan money and the understood order of things within the family, and she had been the center of that order for 30 years. I disrupted the order simply by existing. I didn't understand this at first. Margaret was perfectly civil to me in those early years. Not warm, exactly, but present and appropriate and occasionally even helpful. She sent casseroles when I was sick. She remembered birthdays. She attended the children's school events with a punctuality that suggested obligation rather than desire. On the surface, everything was fine. Kevin and I had 2 children. Our son, Ben, arrived 2 years into our marriage, a blue-eyed, serious-faced boy who looked exactly like his father and thought about everything twice before he said it. Our daughter, Sophie, came 4 years later. Sophie was her own creature entirely, dark-haired and loud and achingly funny, with my mother's directness and a laugh that filled every room she was in. I loved being their mother more than I had expected to love anything. I had worked in marketing before the children arrived, a modest career, nothing remarkable, the kind of work I was good at without being passionate about. When Ben was born and Kevin's schedule intensified with the company, it made practical sense for me to step back from full-time work. I did, and I didn't regret it. I told myself I would return to it when the children were older. I believed that. What I didn't fully account for was what stepping back meant, structurally, for my position in the world. I had no income. The house was in Kevin's name, purchased before we married and never transferred. The savings accounts were joint, but the primary income and the primary assets all originated with the Callahans. I had become, without quite noticing the process, entirely financially dependent on a family whose matriarch had never fully accepted me. I'm not saying Kevin planned this. I don't believe he did. I think it happened gradually, the way things erode gradually, a decision here, an omission there, a collective drifting in a direction that serves the people with the power and disadvantages the person without it. I think Kevin loved me, in his way, for a long time. I also think that when Margaret finally pushed, he didn't have enough of himself left to push back. The signs, in hindsight, were there for about 2 years before everything fell apart. Kevin worked later and later. He was present less and less. He was distracted at dinners and short in conversations, and there was a particular blankness in his eyes sometimes that I had never seen in the early years. I asked him about it more than once. He said it was work stress. He said his father's health was worrying him. He said he was fine. He also started having conversations with his mother that stopped when I entered the room. I noticed. I filed it. I told myself that long marriages go through seasons and that this was a difficult one and that we would come through it. I still, at that point, believed in the foundation. The Tuesday morning Margaret Callahan came to my kitchen and set divorce papers on my table. Kevin was at work. Or that was where I assumed he was. He had left early that morning, earlier than usual, kissing me on the cheek in the kitchen doorway with a distracted abruptness that I had grown accustomed to. I had given the kids breakfast and sent them up to get ready for school and was sitting at the kitchen table with my second cup of coffee when I heard a knock at the front door. Margaret stood on my porch in a camel coat and low heels, her hair perfect, her expression composed. She had a leather portfolio under her arm. She smiled when I opened the door, not a warm smile, but the kind that means a person has been waiting a long time to do what they are about to do. "Can I come in?" she said, in the tone of someone who has already decided they are coming in. I stepped aside. She sat at my kitchen table in the chair that was not my chair. She opened the portfolio. She set the papers in front of me, aligned neatly with the edge of the table. "Kevin asked me to bring these," she said. "He thought it might be easier this way." I looked at the papers. I looked at her. I looked at the papers again. "Kevin sent his mother," I said. "He didn't think he could." She paused, selecting the word with care. "Manage the conversation." I sat down. I was aware of Sophie laughing at something upstairs. The ordinary morning sounds of my ordinary house, continuing around something that had just cracked it down the middle. "He's already made arrangements," Margaret said. "There's an apartment near his office. He'll explain everything when he talks to you this evening." She said it all in the tone of someone delivering information rather than destroying a life. Clean. Efficient. Like a woman who had rehearsed this and was pleased with her own composure. And there it was, the smile. The same smile I had been watching for 13 years, the one that lived just behind the polished surface of her face, the one that appeared on the occasions when something was going the way Margaret Callahan had decided it should go. I did not cry. I don't know why. Maybe because Sophie was upstairs. Maybe because something in me went very still in that moment, the way things go still before a long storm. I picked up the papers. I set them on the counter. I looked at Margaret Callahan sitting at my kitchen table in my kitchen chair. "Thank you for coming," I said. She blinked. That wasn't what she'd expected. "Of course," she said, after a moment. She gathered her portfolio and stood. I walked her to the door. I waited until her car had backed out of the driveway. I went upstairs and helped Sophie with her hair and walked both kids to the corner where the school bus came. I came back to the empty house and I stood in my kitchen for a long time, looking at those papers on the counter. And I thought about what my mother had told me, all those years ago. Never let someone else hold the thing you most need. I had let that happen. Slowly. Without noticing. And now I was standing in a house that wasn't mine, with 13 years of my life in those papers on the counter, and no income, and no attorney, and no plan. But I was not broken. Not yet. And not ever. Though I didn't know that yet with certainty. What I did know, standing in that kitchen on that Tuesday morning, was that Margaret Callahan had been smiling. And I wanted to understand why. Kevin came home that evening and I let him talk. I stood against the kitchen counter with my arms crossed and I let him explain himself, because I wanted to hear all of it, every version of the story he had prepared. He was uncomfortable, pale and stiff in the way of someone who has rehearsed something and finds that the rehearsal doesn't quite survive contact with the actual moment. He talked about the marriage drifting, about feeling like they had grown in different directions, about needing space to figure out who he was. He used the word authentic twice, which told me someone had helped him find his language for this. He talked for about 15 minutes, and at no point during those 15 minutes did he look me directly in the eyes. When he finished, I asked one question. How long has your mother been planning this? He looked at me then. Just briefly. Then he looked away. This is between us, he said. Kevin. He was quiet for a long moment. She's just looking out for the family. She's looking out for the money, I said. He didn't deny it. He left that evening. He went to the apartment he had apparently rented 3 weeks earlier, a detail that landed like a stone. The apartment was rented before he had spoken a word to me, before he had made a single move to address whatever he claimed was wrong between us. The decision had been made. I had simply not been informed of it. I got the kids to bed. I sat up until 2 in the morning reading the divorce papers. They were thorough and specific and strategically constructed. The terms proposed were, on the surface, seemingly reasonable: a monthly support payment, educational provisions for the children, a timeline for me to vacate the house. But when I read carefully, and I did read carefully, I began to see the architecture of it. The support payment was calculated based on a valuation of Kevin's personal income that had apparently been structured to minimize his visible earnings. The house was proposed for sale with the proceeds to be split 60-40 in Kevin's favor, based on a claim that he had paid the full down payment from premarital assets. The Callahan family business, to which Kevin devoted 60 or more hours a week and from which the family's real wealth derived, was described as entirely separate from marital assets, held in a trust that predated our marriage. Kevin personally was not wealthy. Kevin was an employee of wealth that was controlled by Margaret. I read all of this and I thought, she did this before. Or she had planned it before. The trust structure, the income arrangement, the careful separation of business assets from personal ones, none of this was improvised in response to our marriage failing. This had been constructed at some point, perhaps years ago, perhaps even before Kevin married me, as a permanent mechanism for ensuring that whoever he married could be removed from the family without disturbing the financial structure. I was not the first thing Margaret had protected against. I was just the current one. The attorney I hired was named James Okafor, and he came recommended by my college roommate who had gone through her own divorce 4 years earlier. James was 40 years old, compact and precise, with the quiet confidence of someone who has won enough difficult cases to stop needing to announce it. When I sat across from him in his office and spread the divorce documents on his desk, he read them without speaking for several minutes. When he looked up, he said, "Tell me about the business." I told him everything I knew about Callahan and Sons. Everything Kevin had ever shared with me over 13 years of dinners and conversations and late-night talks. The contracts, the projects, the key clients, the growth years, the difficult years, the ways Kevin's role had expanded as his father's health declined. I told James about the hours Kevin worked and the degree to which Kevin's contribution had shaped the company's recent success. I told him about the trust structure, as far as I understood it. James listened to all of it. Then he said, "Has Kevin ever been compensated below market rate for his work at the company?" I looked at him. Because if a family business has been deliberately underpaying a family member who is also a spouse, and structuring that person's compensation to minimize marital assets while building family trust assets, that's relevant to equitable distribution. He paused. It's also not an unusual structure in family business divorces. It's just usually done carefully enough that it's hard to see. He set down his pen. I want to pull the business records. We filed a response to the divorce petition 10 days later. It was careful and it was specific and it contested nearly every major financial premise in Kevin's filing. It also included a formal request for discovery, which meant Callahan and Sons' financial records for the preceding 5 years were now subject to court-ordered disclosure. I know that Margaret Callahan received notice of that discovery request, because Kevin called me 2 days after it was filed and his voice had a quality I had not heard before, tightly controlled, with something underneath it that I recognized after a moment as concern. "You don't have to do this," he said. "We can work something out directly." "We could have worked something out directly before your mother came to my kitchen," I said. A silence. "I know how that looked," he said. "Kevin," I said quietly, "you sent your mother. With papers. While our children were upstairs." Another silence. "I'll call you later this week," he said, and hung up. He didn't call later that week. But Margaret did. Her voice on the phone was different from the voice she had used at my kitchen table. The composure was the same, but underneath it there was a texture I recognized from years of paying close attention to that woman. A slight tightening, a particular precision of word choice that Margaret employed when she felt the ground beneath her shifting. She suggested that we meet for coffee, that we talk, just the two of us, woman to woman, about what was best for the children and the family. I said I would have to check my schedule. I did not call her back. What she didn't know, what neither she nor Kevin knew yet, was what James Okafor had begun to find in the business records. The discovery process revealed things that even James said were more significant than he had initially expected. The records from Callahan & Sons for the preceding 5 years showed a consistent and documented pattern of compensation management. Kevin's official salary had been held, year over year, at a figure that was roughly 40% below industry standard for a person with his title, responsibilities, and company tenure. In the same period, the family trust that held the majority of the business ownership had seen its value increase substantially, driven in no small part by client relationships and contracts that Kevin had personally developed and maintained. In simpler terms, Kevin had been building the company's value while being paid as though he were a mid-level manager, and the difference between what he earned and what his contribution was worth had been accumulating in a trust controlled by Margaret. James pulled comparable compensation data. He got an affidavit from a business valuation expert who reviewed Kevin's actual role and responsibilities against his documented pay. The gap was clear and specific and not, in James's view, accidental. She structured it this way on purpose, James said, when he laid this out for me. The low salary keeps Kevin's visible income, and therefore the marital estate's basis, artificially small. The trust captures the real value. And the trust predates your marriage, so in a standard analysis it's separate property. But it isn't separate, I said. It's built on his work. That's exactly the argument, James said. He also found something that neither of us had been looking for specifically, something that emerged from the deeper financial records and that changed the shape of everything. About 8 months before Kevin served me with divorce papers, there had been a significant transaction involving Callahan & Sons. A strategic consulting firm had been engaged to assess the company for a potential partial acquisition or partnership deal with a larger regional construction group. The assessment had been completed. A preliminary agreement had been signed. Kevin's name was not on the agreement. Margaret's name was. The value attributed to Kevin's client portfolio and ongoing relationships, documented in the assessment, had been used to establish the company's worth for the purposes of that deal. And yet Kevin had received no equity adjustment, no compensation increase, no acknowledgement in the deal structure that his contribution had been the thing that made the number possible. He had built it. She had sold a piece of it. He had received nothing additional. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I need you to understand something about what happened when James showed me this. I had spent 2 months being angry, cleanly, specifically, rightfully angry at what had been done to me. And I was still angry. But when I looked at this document, something shifted. Not sympathy, exactly. Not forgiveness. But an understanding of a fuller picture. Kevin hadn't just betrayed me. Kevin had been in a cage of his own for years. The same woman who had served me divorce papers at my kitchen table had spent decades quietly owning her son. She had shaped his compensation to limit his independence. She had structured his professional life to ensure that his real wealth always flowed to her. She had kept him financially tethered to the family in a way that made genuine independence, including the independence to stay in a marriage she didn't sanction, nearly impossible. I don't say this to excuse him. He made his choices. He could have stood up and didn't. He sent his mother to my kitchen with papers while my children slept upstairs, and that is a specific failure of character that no structural explanation fully resolves. But I understood now that Margaret had not just done something to me. She had been doing something to her son for 30 years. And when the time came to protect the money, she had used him as the instrument. Has anyone ever done something like this to you? Use someone you loved as the vehicle for something that served only them? If you've ever found yourself standing in the wreckage of a relationship and realized the damage started somewhere you didn't expect, tell me in the comments. You don't have to have lived through a divorce. Sometimes this pattern shows up in every corner of family life. The deposition was scheduled for a Monday morning in March. Margaret Callahan was named as a witness in my counterclaim, given her role in the business compensation structure and the preliminary acquisition agreement. James had served her with notice 3 weeks earlier. She arrived at James's office on that Monday morning in her usual camel coat, her usual composure, her usual immaculate appearance. She sat across from James at the conference table with her own attorney, a man named Charles Whitmore who had represented the Callahans for over 20 years. I was in the room. That was my right. I sat to James's left and I did not speak and I did not take my eyes off Margaret's face. James began with the business compensation records. He walked through them question by question, year by year, asking Margaret to confirm the salary structure, the rationale, the decision-making process. She answered carefully, in the particular way of someone who has been prepared thoroughly, not evasive enough to look dishonest, but controlled enough to give nothing extra. Then James set a document on the table. The preliminary acquisition agreement. He asked Margaret to describe her role in the negotiation. Whitmore interjected immediately. There was a brief procedural exchange. James waited it out and repeated the question. Margaret looked at the document. For the first time since she had sat down, her composure cracked slightly, not dramatically, not visibly enough that a stranger would have seen it, but I had spent 13 years watching that face. She had not expected us to have that document. She answered in careful, minimal terms. She confirmed she had signed the agreement. She characterized it as an administrative action on behalf of the trust. She said Kevin had been informed. James asked whether Kevin had been compensated for the increase in company valuation that his client relationships had produced. Whitmore objected. James asked the question again in different words. Margaret said that Kevin's compensation was set by the board. James asked who comprised the board. A pause. She named herself. Her husband Dennis, now largely incapacitated by his health. And Kevin. James asked whether Kevin had voted to approve his own below-market salary. Another pause. Longer. The board decisions are documented, she said. They are, James agreed pleasantly. I have them here. He set another document on the table. I watched Charles Whitmore read it. I watched his expression do something small and careful that experienced attorneys do when they are recalibrating. And I understood, sitting in that conference room on a March morning, that the thing Margaret had spent 30 years building was about to be looked at very carefully in a very bright light. The months between the deposition and the final settlement hearing were long ones. Long in the particular way of legal proceedings, where the work is constant and detailed and happens mostly in offices and documents and phone calls, and the actual pace of resolution feels like water finding its level, slow but inevitable. James had built a case that was, by his own measured assessment, very strong. The core of it was a legal theory called fraudulent transfer, the argument that Margaret had structured Kevin's compensation over many years in a manner designed to minimize marital assets and transfer value to the family trust, and that this structure constituted an inequitable manipulation of marital property. In addition to the business records and the acquisition agreement, James had also found documentation that addressed something I had not known to ask about. In the 2 years before Kevin served me divorce papers, there had been a series of legal changes to the family trust documents. Small revisions, incremental, each one defensible in isolation. Taken together, they had the effect of tightening Margaret's control over the trust while technically maintaining Kevin's nominal board membership. The revisions had been made by Charles Whitmore's firm. They had been made, according to the document dates, beginning about 3 months after Kevin and I had our first serious argument, a long, difficult conversation about the marriage that I had thought was private. I asked James whether he thought Margaret had been told about that conversation. He looked at me steadily. I think it's worth asking. The answer to that question came from a source I hadn't expected. Kevin's younger sister, Claire, called me on a Wednesday evening in April. Claire was 34, unmarried, and had always existed at the edges of the Callahan family in a way I had never fully understood, present at events, consistently underestimated, rarely included in the real conversations. She and I had never been close, but we had always been cordial in a way that was slightly different from the careful cordiality I maintained with the rest of the family. Something about Claire had always felt genuine. She called and she said, "I want to tell you something." And I want you to know that I'm not doing it for anything except that what happened to you isn't right. I sat down and I listened. Claire told me that the conversation Kevin and I had had, the private, difficult one about the marriage, had been described by Kevin to his mother in full detail the following day. Not as a request for advice. As a report. The way a person reports to someone they are accountable to. She also told me that Margaret had responded to that report by calling Charles Whitmore. 3 months later, the trust revisions began. Claire had been present, peripherally, for enough of these conversations to have heard and understood what she was hearing, even if she hadn't fully known what to do with it. She had been present at a family dinner 6 months before the divorce papers were served, at which Margaret had, in her careful way, outlined a plan, framed as concern for Kevin's well-being, framed as looking out for the family, that was, in its plainest form, a plan to end the marriage on terms that protected the family assets. She talked about you like you were a problem to be managed, Claire said. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Not a person. Just a risk. I thanked her. I sat in the quiet house after we hung up and thought about what it meant to have been seen as a risk rather than a person. I thought about the 13 years and the casseroles and the birthday cards and the school events Margaret had attended with that particular punctuality of obligation. I thought about what it meant to live inside a performance of acceptance while someone had been quietly deciding how to remove you. Claire gave James a sworn affidavit. She was precise and detailed, and the picture it painted was consistent with every document James had already assembled. Kevin learned about the affidavit from his attorney. He called me that evening. His voice sounded different from any version of Kevin I had heard in recent memory. Not rehearsed, not controlled, not careful. Just tired. And something else. She did all of this, he said. The whole time. I know, I said. A silence. I let her, he said. It was the most honest thing Kevin Callahan had said to me in years. Maybe the most honest thing he had said to me in the marriage, which was its own kind of devastating thing to realize. I know that too, I said. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What do you want, Nora? What do you actually want out of this?" I thought about it. I thought about it carefully, the way I had been thinking about it for months, because the answer to that question had changed for me over the course of those months in ways I hadn't expected. I want the children to have what they're owed, I said. I want a fair accounting of 13 years. And I want it on the record. The record, he repeated. What your mother did, I said. I want it documented. I want there to be a record that says she structured the money the way she did and why. A pause. She won't accept that, he said. I know, I said. There was another silence, and in it I heard something shift. Something settle. I don't know if Kevin made a decision in that moment or if it had been building for a while. But something changed. I'm going to talk to my own attorney, he said. Not Whitmore. He got his own attorney. The final settlement hearing took place on a Thursday morning in early June. The courtroom was small and institutional, and the June light came flat through the high windows. Kevin sat at the respondent's table with his own attorney, a woman named Patricia Ewan, who had been recommended to him, I later learned, by someone entirely outside the family circle. Margaret was present in the gallery, seated beside Charles Whitmore, who was there in an observational capacity only. His role had been formally reduced when Kevin retained separate counsel. I sat beside James and I was calmer than I expected to be. I had been many things over the preceding 7 months. Afraid, furious, exhausted, heartbroken, determined, and I had felt all of those things fully and specifically and at appropriate moments. But that morning in that courtroom I felt clear. James presented our case methodically. He walked the court through the business compensation structure, the trust revisions, the acquisition agreement, Claire's affidavit, the pattern of deliberate financial structuring that had characterized the Callahan family's management of marital assets throughout the marriage. He presented the business valuation analysis showing what Kevin's contribution had been worth versus what he had been paid. He presented the timeline of trust revisions against the timeline of events in the marriage. Kevin's attorney, Patricia Ewan, did not contest the financial analysis. She did not dispute the compensation records or the acquisition agreement. She had advised Kevin, and Kevin had agreed, to move toward a cooperative resolution rather than a contested one. which meant that Patricia's role was primarily to ensure Kevin's interests were fairly represented within a framework of genuine settlement. Charles Whitmore made one attempt, from the gallery, to pass a note to Kevin's table. Patricia received it, read it, and set it face down. She did not pass it to Kevin. The judge was a woman named Honorable Sandra Tate, who had been on the family court bench for 16 years. She had reviewed the submissions thoroughly. I could tell by the quality of her questions during the proceeding, the precision with which she referenced specific documents. She was not a theatrical judge. She was a thorough one, which was exactly what this case required. She approved a settlement that included several specific provisions I want to describe, because each one mattered. Kevin's below-market compensation over the marriage was quantified and treated as a contribution to marital assets, which meant the gap between what he had been paid and what the valuation expert determined his fair market compensation should have been was added to the marital estate calculation. The preliminary acquisition agreement, and the business value it had established using Kevin's client relationships, was incorporated into the asset picture. Kevin's contribution to the value that had been sold was formally recognized. The combined effect was a marital estate significantly larger than the one described in Kevin's original divorce filing, larger by a figure that allowed me to walk out of that courtroom with an equitable share of 13 years. The house was mine. The children's educational provisions were fully funded from the Callahan family assets, not from Kevin's nominal salary. The monthly support was calculated against a realistic income figure. But there was one additional provision, and it was the one Margaret had feared most. The court record contained a formal finding that described the compensation structure and the trust management as a pattern of financial manipulation affecting marital assets. It was not a criminal finding. This was a family court proceeding, not a criminal one. But it was a public document. It was a record. The record that said what had been done, and by whom, and why. I watched Margaret Callahan's face when the judge read that finding. The composure was still there. It was always there. But underneath it, for the first time in 13 years of watching that face, I saw something I had not seen before. She knew it was in the record. The smile was gone. Kevin and I spoke briefly in the hallway afterward. It was a strange conversation. Not warm, not hostile, just quiet and real and slightly raw. He looked older than he had 7 months earlier. Something had changed in him through the process of it all. Some long-held thing had shifted, and I didn't know yet what he would become on the other side of it. "I'm sorry," he said, "for how it was done. For letting her." I nodded. I accepted that. Not as absolution. There are some things that aren't absolved, but as the thing it was, which was honest. "Take care of the kids," I said. "I will," he said. And I believed him. The house I kept was on a tree-lined street in the part of Knoxville I had returned to after everything. I had moved back to be near my own mother, who was 71 now and still practical and still direct, and who, when I told her the full story, said simply, "You paid attention. That's why you won." Ben was 13 by then and Sophie was 9, and they split their time between Kevin's apartment and my house, and the transitions were hard the way transitions always are for children, but they were manageable. Ben had taken to sitting in the kitchen with me in the evenings and talking about things I had not expected him to talk about. He was his father's son in so many ways, but he had started asking questions that surprised me. Questions about fairness, about people, about why adults sometimes did things that didn't make sense. I tried to answer them honestly, at the level of a 13-year-old's understanding, without making his father or his grandmother into monsters. Sophie adapted the way Sophie adapted to everything. Loudly, thoroughly, with her full self. She declared one evening at dinner that Grandma Margaret was kind of weird and cold and moved on from the observation in approximately 4 seconds, and I loved her so much in that moment I couldn't speak. I went back to work. Not the same marketing career I had paused 13 years earlier, but something closer to what I had actually wanted. I took a communications director role at a regional nonprofit focused on economic empowerment for women, which felt, in its specific way, like exactly the right thing. I was good at it. I had not lost that. I think about my mother's advice a lot these days. Never let someone else hold the thing you most need. I had let that happen, and it had cost me years of vulnerability and the brutal experience of having a woman serve me divorce papers at my own kitchen table while she smiled at me. But here is what I also think. I had not let it destroy me. And the reason I had not let it destroy me was not just resilience, though I was resilient, and I had earned the right to say so, but the specific, practical inheritance of a mother who had taught me that the world responded to attention and preparation and the willingness to ask the hard question before someone else sets the terms. I paid attention. I found James Okafor. I listened to a woman who called on a Wednesday evening because she'd decided that what happened to me wasn't right. I read the documents carefully, all of them, late at night at a kitchen table in a house that was not yet mine but would be. And when Margaret Callahan had smiled at me across that table, I had not crumbled. I had started to look. That is the thing I want to leave with you. Not the settlement figures. Not the courtroom finding. But this, the same moment that a person tries to hand you your ending is sometimes, if you look at it differently, the moment your real story begins. The papers on the table, the smile across the kitchen, the closed door and the empty house. None of that was the end of me. It was the beginning of me finally understanding what I was capable of. And the women who are listening to this right now, or the men, or anyone who has ever sat at a table where someone else was trying to decide what their life was worth, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not what someone else's plan says you are. You are what you do next. By the way, where are you watching this story from? Let us know in the comments, because it's genuinely amazing to see how far these stories travel around the world. And if this one stayed with you, if it reminded you of something you've carried, give it a like and subscribe, because every week we bring you a story that says, you are not alone, and truth always finds a way.